Sarah recognized this as a description of what existential philosophers had termed authenticity crisis, the profound disorientation that could occur when an individual suddenly became aware of the extent to which their life had been shaped by external forces rather than genuine internal choice. For most people, this awareness led to gradual life changes, career shifts, relationship adjustments, new hobbies or interests. But for individuals like Marcus, the revelation was so complete and devastating that it necessitated a total reset. "So you decided to eliminate all external influences," Sarah said. "I decided to find out who I actually was underneath all the conditioning," Marcus corrected. "And the only way to do that was to remove every voice except my own." The process Marcus described didn't happen overnight. Like many individuals who chose total withdrawal, he had implemented it systematically over several months. First, he had begun declining social invitations, claiming work pressures or fatigue. Then he had gradually reduced communication with friends and family, responding to calls and texts with increasing delays until eventually not responding at all. He had ended his engagement through a carefully crafted letter that he had rewritten dozens of times, trying to explain his decision without causing unnecessary pain or confusion. The professional withdrawal had been more complex. Marcus had continued working for several months while implementing his personal isolation, but he found that maintaining professional relationships while eliminating personal ones created an unsustainable psychological split. "I was performing two different versions of myself," he explained. "The engaged, collaborative professional during the day, and the increasingly isolated individual during evenings and weekends. The cognitive dissonance became unbearable. His resignation had been strategic rather than impulsive." Marcus had spent months researching remote work opportunities and passive income streams. He had simplified his financial obligations, eliminated debt, and created a lifestyle that required minimal external interaction. His current income came from freelance consulting work that he could complete entirely through email and digital platforms, allowing him to maintain financial independence without face-to-face human contact. "The first 6 months were the most difficult," Marcus admitted. "Not because I missed people exactly, but because I had to learn how to exist without constant external feedback and validation. When you remove other people's opinions, expectations, and reactions from your daily experience, you're left with a kind of silence that can be overwhelming. You have to develop entirely new ways of understanding yourself and measuring your life." This period of adjustment aligned with what Sarah had observed in other cases. The initial phase of voluntary exile often involved what she termed ego dissolution, the temporary breakdown of the self-concept that had been constructed through social interaction and external validation. This could be disorienting and even frightening, but for individuals who successfully navigated this transition, it often led to what they described as a more authentic sense of self. Marcus described this period as archaeological. He had spent months excavating his own psyche, trying to identify which of his beliefs, preferences, fears, and desires were genuinely his own versus those that had been adopted from external sources. "It's like trying to figure out which thoughts in your head are your own voice and which are echoes of conversations you've had with other people," he said. The process had involved extensive journaling, meditation, and what Marcus called preference testing, systematically exposing himself to various experiences, ideas, and activities to determine his authentic responses without social influence. He read books he had never considered before, listened to music outside his usual genres, experimented with different daily routines and living spaces, all while carefully observing his genuine reactions versus his socially conditioned responses. "What I discovered," Marcus said, "was that probably 70% of what I thought were my personal preferences and beliefs were actually just internalized expectations from family, friends, colleagues, and society. My career choice, my lifestyle, my relationship patterns, even my taste in food and entertainment, most of it had been unconsciously selected to gain approval or avoid disapproval from others." This discovery had been both liberating and disturbing. Liberation came from finally understanding why so much of his successful life had felt hollow and performative. The disturbance came from recognizing how little of his identity had been authentically his own. "It's like discovering you've been living someone else's life without realizing it," he explained. Sarah had seen this realization in numerous cases of voluntary withdrawal. The individuals who chose total isolation often described a profound sense of relief at finally stopping the exhausting performance of social existence, combined with grief for the years they felt they had lost to inauthenticity. Many reported that the energy they had previously devoted to managing relationships, maintaining their image, and meeting social expectations could now be redirected toward genuine self-exploration and development. Marcus's daily life in isolation had developed its own rhythm and structure. He woke without an alarm, allowing his natural circadian rhythms to determine his sleep schedule. His days were organized around activities that he had identified as genuinely meaningful to him: reading philosophy and psychology, practicing yoga and meditation, learning new skills through online courses, creating digital art, and maintaining an extensive journal that served as both creative outlet and psychological processing tool. People assume that isolation means stagnation or depression, Marcus said, but my life has never been more dynamic or growth-oriented. When you remove the obligation to maintain relationships and social roles, you have enormous amounts of time and energy available for other pursuits. I've learned more about myself and the world in 18 months of isolation than I did in the previous 10 years of conventional social existence. This perspective challenged common assumptions about the relationship between social connection and personal growth. While psychological research consistently demonstrated the importance of relationships for mental health and well-being, Marcus and others like him seem to have found alternative pathways to fulfillment and development that bypass traditional social structures entirely. Sarah had been developing a theoretical framework to understand this phenomenon. Her research suggested that some individuals possessed what she termed high autonomy needs, personality characteristics that made them particularly sensitive to external influence and control. For these individuals, traditional social relationships might actually inhibit rather than support psychological development, creating a conflict between their need for authentic self-expression and their desire to maintain social connections. The psychological literature contains scattered references to similar concepts. Psychologist David Reisman had distinguished between inner-directed and other-directed personality types, with inner-directed individuals being more guided by internal principles and values than by social expectations. Carl Jung had written about the necessity of withdrawing from collective consciousness to develop individual consciousness. More recently, researchers studying introversion and high sensitivity had identified personality traits that made some individuals particularly drained by social interaction and particularly energized by solitude. But Marcus's case went beyond simple introversion or high sensitivity. His withdrawal was so complete, and his reported satisfaction with isolation so genuine, that it challenged fundamental assumptions about human social needs. Either he represented an extreme but healthy variation in human psychology, or he was engaging in an elaborate form of psychological self-deception that masked deeper pathology. "Do you ever feel lonely?" Sarah asked, exploring one of the key questions in her research. Marcus considered this carefully. "I think most people confuse loneliness with aloneness," he said finally. "Loneliness is wanting connection and not having it. Aloneness is simply being by yourself. For the first time in my adult life, I'm genuinely alone without being lonely. In fact, I was much more lonely when I was surrounded by people I didn't authentically connect with than I am now in my chosen solitude." This distinction had emerged repeatedly in Sarah's interviews with individuals who had chosen total withdrawal. They consistently reported that their worst experiences of loneliness had occurred not in isolation, but in social situations where they felt misunderstood, inauthentic, or disconnected despite being physically surrounded by others. Their chosen solitude, by contrast, felt peaceful and fulfilling rather than empty or painful. "But don't you miss intimacy?" Sarah pressed. "The deep connection that comes from being truly known by another person?" Marcus's expression became thoughtful. "I think that's based on the assumption that other people can truly know us better than we can know ourselves. My experience suggests the opposite. The deepest intimacy I've ever experienced has been with myself, understanding my own thoughts, emotions, motivations, and patterns without the distortion that comes from trying to explain or justify them to someone else." This response touched on what Sarah had identified as a core philosophical difference between individuals who chose isolation and those who remained embedded in social structures. The majority of people seem to rely on relationships not just for emotional support and companionship, but for fundamental aspects of self-understanding and identity validation. They discovered who they were through interaction with others, defined themselves in relation to family and friends, and relied on external feedback to gauge their worth and progress. Individuals like Marcus appeared to have developed alternative internal mechanisms for these functions. They had learned to provide their own emotional support through self-compassion and self-care practices. They derived companionship from their relationship with themselves, finding internal dialogue and self-reflection as engaging as conversation with others. Most significantly, they had developed the capacity for self-validation. determining their worth and progress through internal rather than external measures. The question that fascinates me, Sarah said, is whether this capacity for complete self-sufficiency is something you developed as a response to inadequate or disappointing relationships, or whether it's an innate characteristic that made traditional relationships feel constraining. Marcus leaned back in his chair, considering her question. Both, I think. I believe I've always been naturally inclined toward autonomy and self-direction. But I also think our culture systematically trains that instinct out of most people from childhood. We're taught that our value comes from external validation, that happiness requires other people, that isolation is pathological. So even people with strong autonomous tendencies learn to suppress them and force themselves into social molds that don't fit. This observation aligned with Sarah's growing conviction that voluntary withdrawal might represent not pathology, but rather a healthy response to pathological social conditions. Modern Western culture seemed to create enormous pressure for extroversion, constant connectivity, and social performance that might be genuinely toxic for certain personality types. From this perspective, individuals who chose isolation weren't fleeing from health toward sickness, but rather from sickness toward health. The session had lasted nearly 2 hours, far longer than Sarah's typical 50-minute appointments. Marcus had proved to be an articulate and thoughtful interview subject, offering insights into his experience that challenged many of her preconceptions about isolation and withdrawal. As he prepared to leave, she found herself genuinely curious about his life outside her office. "Would you be willing to meet again next week?" she asked. "I find your perspective fascinating, and I think our conversations might be mutually beneficial." Marcus paused at the door. "You're not going to try to convince me to reconnect with my family or start dating again? I'm not convinced that would be in your best interests," Sarah replied honestly. "I'm more interested in understanding whether the path you've chosen is sustainable long-term, and what it might teach us about human psychology more broadly." For the first time during their conversation, Marcus smiled. "In that case, yes, I'd like to continue our discussions." After Marcus left, Sarah sat in her office reviewing the notes she had taken during their conversation. His case was forcing her to reconsider some of her fundamental assumptions about mental health and human flourishing. The standard psychological model suggested that healthy individuals were those who maintained satisfying relationships, contributed to their communities, and remained integrated into social structures. But Marcus appeared to be thriving, according to every measure except social connectivity. He was intellectually engaged, emotionally stable, financially self-sufficient, physically healthy, and reported high levels of life satisfaction. His withdrawal from society hadn't led to deterioration in any area of functioning. If anything, he seemed more focused and productive than he had been during his conventionally successful career. The only concerning aspect of his situation was its deviation from social norms. Sarah began drafting her initial assessment report, knowing that it would likely be controversial among her colleagues. The mental health field was deeply invested in the idea that human connection was essential for psychological well-being, suggesting that some individuals might actually benefit from complete social withdrawal, challenged core assumptions of the profession. But her research was pointing toward a more complex understanding of human psychological diversity. Just as the field had eventually recognized that introversion was a healthy personality variation rather than a social deficit, perhaps it was time to consider that extreme autonomy and chosen isolation might also represent valid ways of being human. Over the following weeks, Sarah's sessions with Marcus continued to challenge her understanding of isolation and withdrawal. Each conversation revealed new layers of his experience and raised additional questions about the nature of human social needs. Marcus proved to be a keen observer of his own psychological processes, offering detailed descriptions of his internal experience that provided unprecedented insight into the psychology of voluntary exile. During their third session, Marcus described what he called the silence period, approximately 4 months into his isolation when he had stopped engaging in any form of external communication, including reading news, checking social media, or consuming any media content created by other people. "I wanted to experience pure internal silence," he explained, "to see what my mind would produce when it wasn't constantly responding to external stimuli." This period had been both the most challenging and most revelatory of his isolation experience. Without external input to react to or process, Marcus had confronted the raw content of his own consciousness. "You discover things about your mind that are impossible to see when it's constantly occupied with social interaction and media consumption," he said. "Patterns of thought, emotional rhythms, creative impulses that get completely overwhelmed by the noise of modern life. The experience he described sounded similar to extended meditation retreats or sensory deprivation experiences, but sustained over months rather than days or weeks. Marcus reported moving through several distinct phases during this period. Initial anxiety and restlessness, followed by profound boredom, then a kind of mental clearing that eventually gave way to what he described as creative emergence. Around month 6, I started having ideas and insights that felt completely original, he said. Not responses to things I had read or heard, not variations on existing concepts, but genuinely new thoughts emerging from the depths of my own consciousness. It was like discovering that I'd been living off intellectual fast food my entire life, and finally learning to cook from scratch. Sarah found this description particularly intriguing because it suggested that Marcus's withdrawal might have facilitated a kind of psychological development that was impossible within traditional social structures. If authentic creativity and original thinking required a degree of separation from collective consciousness, then voluntary isolation might serve an important developmental function for certain individuals. What kinds of insights emerged during this period? Sarah asked. Marcus hesitated, then smiled. This might sound grandiose, but I started developing my own philosophical framework for understanding existence and human psychology, not based on what I had read or been taught, but on direct observation of my own inner landscape and the patterns I discovered there. He went on to describe a complex system of ideas about consciousness, identity, and human potential that he had been developing through extensive journaling and reflection. While some elements echoed existing philosophical and psychological concepts, the overall framework appeared to be genuinely original, emerging from his unique experience of prolonged self-exploration. I realized that most people never get to discover their own original ideas because they're constantly consuming and responding to other people's thoughts, Marcus explained. The human mind is incredibly creative and insightful, but that creativity gets buried under layers of social conditioning and external input. Isolation gave me access to mental resources I never knew I possessed. This observation aligned with research Sarah had been reviewing on creativity and solitude. Studies consistently showed that breakthrough innovations and original insights were more likely to emerge during periods of solitude and reflection than during social interaction or collaborative work. Many of history's most significant thinkers, from Darwin to Einstein to Tesla, had been known for their preference for solitude and their ability to sustain long periods of isolated reflection. But Marcus was describing something more extreme than the periodic solitude that many creative individuals sought. He had eliminated social input almost entirely for months at a time, creating conditions for psychological exploration that were unprecedented in Sarah's experience. The question was whether this extreme approach produced proportionally greater insights, or whether it represented a kind of psychological overreach that might ultimately prove unsustainable or counterproductive. Do you ever worry that your isolation might be causing you to lose touch with reality? Sarah asked, voicing one of the primary concerns that mental health professionals typically had about extended withdrawal. Marcus considered this seriously. That assumes that consensus reality is more real or valid than individual reality, he said. But what if the opposite is true? What if the shared delusions and collective assumptions of society are actually what cause people to lose touch with deeper truths about existence and human nature? This response revealed what Sarah was beginning to recognize as a fundamental philosophical divide between individuals who chose extreme isolation and those who remained embedded in social structures. Marcus and others like him seemed to view consensus reality not as an objective truth to be maintained, but as a potentially limiting or distorting framework that could prevent access to more authentic or profound understanding. I'm not claiming that all of my insights are objectively true, Marcus continued, but I am claiming that they're authentically mine in a way that most of my previous beliefs and ideas weren't. And I've found that living from this authentic understanding, even if it's incomplete or occasionally incorrect, is far more satisfying than living from inherited assumptions that might be more socially acceptable but feel false to my direct experience. Sarah recognized this as an articulation of what existentialist philosophers had called authentic existence, living according to one's own understanding and values rather than conforming to external expectations or inherited beliefs. But most existentialist thinkers had assumed that authentic existence could be achieved while remaining engaged with society. Marcus seemed to have concluded that authentic existence required complete separation from social influence. As their sessions continued over several months, Sarah began to develop a more nuanced understanding of Marcus's psychological state and the factors that had led to his dramatic withdrawal. Far from representing pathology or dysfunction, his isolation appeared to be serving specific developmental functions that would have been difficult or impossible to achieve within conventional social structures. The picture that emerged was of an individual with exceptionally high needs for autonomy, authenticity, and creative expression who had found traditional social relationships and professional obligations to be fundamentally constraining. His successful career and social life hadn't been satisfying because they had required him to suppress essential aspects of his personality and potential. The withdrawal wasn't escape from failure. It was an attempt to create conditions for success as he personally defined it. But Sarah also recognized potential risks and limitations in Marcus's chosen path. While his short-term psychological functioning appeared to be excellent, questions remained about the long-term sustainability of complete social isolation. Human beings had evolved as social creatures not just for emotional reasons, but for practical survival advantages. Even in the modern world, complete autonomy was difficult to maintain indefinitely. Moreover, while Marcus reported high levels of satisfaction with his current life, Sarah wondered whether this satisfaction might be partly due to the novelty and relief of his recent escape from social obligations. Would the same level of fulfillment persist if his isolation extended for years or decades? And what would happen if he faced significant life challenges, health problems, financial difficulties, or other crises without any social support network to rely upon? These questions led Sarah to begin developing what she called the phases theory of voluntary withdrawal. Her research suggested that individuals who chose extreme isolation typically moved through several distinct psychological phases, each with different characteristics and challenges. The first phase, which she termed liberation, typically lasted 6 months to 2 years and was characterized by relief, excitement, and rapid personal growth as individuals experienced freedom from social obligations and expectations. This appeared to be the phase Marcus was currently experiencing, marked by high energy, extensive self-exploration, and genuine satisfaction with his chosen lifestyle. The second phase, consolidation, typically emerged after the initial excitement of withdrawal had faded, usually lasting 1 to 3 years. During this phase, individuals work to establish sustainable routines and develop the internal resources necessary for long-term autonomy. This phase could involve periods of loneliness, boredom, or questioning as the individual adapted to the realities of prolonged solitude. The third phase, integration, was the least understood because few of the individuals Sarah had studied had maintained complete isolation long enough to reach it. This phase seemed to involve either a successful adaptation to permanent solitude, leading to what might be considered a genuinely alternative way of being human, or a recognition that some degree of social connection was necessary for long-term well-being, leading to a gradual re-engagement with selected relationships or communities. Sarah's preliminary research suggested that successful navigation through all 3 phases required specific personality characteristics and psychological resources. Individuals with high autonomy needs, strong internal motivation, exceptional self-awareness, and creative or intellectual pursuits that could provide ongoing stimulation and meaning seemed more likely to sustain voluntary withdrawal successfully. Those lacking these characteristics often found isolation progressively more difficult and eventually chose to re-engage with social structures. Marcus appeared to possess many of the characteristics associated with successful long-term withdrawal, but Sarah remained curious about how his experience would evolve over time. Would his current satisfaction and psychological growth continue, or would he eventually encounter limitations or challenges that would require some form of social re-engagement? During one of their later sessions, Sarah decided to explore this question directly. "Have you thought about what your life might look like 5 or 10 years from now?" she asked. "Do you envision maintaining your current level of isolation indefinitely?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, gazing out the window of her office. "I think about that question often," he said finally. "And I honestly don't know. What I do know is that I'm not ready to re-engage with the social world as it currently exists. The person I'm becoming through this process of isolation and self-discovery is fundamentally different from the person I was before. I can't imagine trying to force that new self back into old social patterns and relationships." "But you can imagine eventually developing new types of relationships that would be compatible with your authentic self?" Sarah asked. "Maybe," Marcus said, "but they would have to be based on completely different principles than the relationships I had before. They would have to honor autonomy, support authentic self-expression, and allow for the kind of depth and intensity that I've discovered in my relationship with myself. I'm not sure such relationships are possible within current cultural frameworks." This response highlighted what Sarah had begun to recognize as one of the most significant challenges facing individuals who chose voluntary withdrawal. Even if they successfully used isolation to develop greater self-awareness and authenticity, re-engaging with a social world that operated according to different principles could prove extremely difficult or impossible. They might find themselves permanently changed by their experience in ways that made conventional social relationships unsatisfying or unbearable. Some individuals in Sarah's research had attempted what she called selective re-engagement, gradually developing new relationships with people who could understand and support their transformed perspective. But this process was fraught with difficulties, as most people lacked the framework for understanding what these individuals had experienced during their period of withdrawal. It's like trying to explain color to someone who has only ever seen in black and white. One of Sarah's interview subjects had told her, "The insights and growth that happen during extended isolation are so foreign to most people's experience that meaningful communication about them becomes almost impossible." This communication barrier could lead to a kind of permanent alienation, where individuals who had successfully used isolation for psychological development found themselves unable to bridge the gap between their transformed consciousness and the conventional social world. They might achieve the authentic self-understanding they had sought through withdrawal, but at the cost of ever being able to share that understanding with others. Marcus seemed to be grappling with this dilemma as his isolation period extended. While he reported continued satisfaction with his solitary life, Sarah could detect subtle signs that he was beginning to consider the possibility of some form of social re-engagement. He had started reading contemporary philosophy and psychology again. After months of avoiding external intellectual input, he had begun asking questions about Sarah's research and her perspectives on isolation and human development. Most tellingly, he had continued their therapeutic relationship far longer than necessary to satisfy the legal requirements that had initially brought him to her office. "I think our conversations represent a kind of experiment for me," Marcus admitted during one session. "You're the first person I've had sustained contact with since I began my withdrawal, and I'm curious about whether meaningful dialogue is possible between someone who has experienced deep isolation and someone who remains embedded in conventional social structures." Sarah recognized the significance of this statement. Marcus was using their therapeutic relationship as a testing ground for whether any form of social connection could be compatible with the psychological development he had achieved through isolation. If their conversations continued to feel meaningful and authentic to him, it might open the possibility for other carefully chosen relationships. If he found their dialogue limiting or inauthentic, it might confirm his conviction that complete solitude was the only viable option for someone with his particular psychological makeup. This realization added a new dimension to their sessions. Sarah found herself not just studying Marcus's experience of isolation, but actively participating in his exploration of whether re-engagement with others was possible or desirable. She became acutely aware that her responses and the quality of their interaction might significantly influence his future choices about solitude versus connection. The responsibility was both exciting and daunting. Sarah had entered the field of psychology because she was fascinated by human potential and the possibilities for growth and transformation. Marcus represented an extreme example of self-directed psychological development that challenged many conventional assumptions about mental health and human flourishing. If she could understand his experience and perhaps facilitate some form of integration between his autonomous development and meaningful relationship, it might open new possibilities for therapeutic intervention and human potential more broadly. But Sarah also recognized that imposing her own values or assumptions about the importance of social connection could be harmful or counterproductive. Marcus had achieved something remarkable through his chosen isolation, a level of self-awareness, authenticity, and creative development that might have been impossible through conventional means. Pressuring him to conform to standard social expectations could undermine the very development that made him so psychologically interesting. Instead, Sarah found herself adopting what she came to think of as anthropological curiosity, approaching Marcus's experience as a researcher studying a fascinating but unfamiliar culture, rather than as a clinician treating a disorder. This perspective allowed her to remain genuinely open to the possibility that his chosen path represented a valid alternative to conventional social existence rather than a deviation from psychological health. As winter approached and their sessions continued, Sarah began to notice subtle changes in Marcus's presentation and perspective. While he remained committed to his isolated lifestyle and continued to report high levels of satisfaction with his psychological development, he also seemed to be grappling with questions about purpose and contribution that hadn't been present in their earlier conversations. I've been thinking about the relationship between individual development and collective responsibility, he said during one session. The insights I've gained through isolation feel valuable, but there's something troubling about keeping them entirely to myself. It raises questions about whether extreme autonomy can coexist with ethical obligations to contribute to human understanding or social progress. This concern reflected what Sarah had observed in several individuals who had maintained long-term isolation. While the early phases of withdrawal were often focused entirely on individual liberation and development, successful navigation of prolonged solitude sometimes led to reconsidering questions of purpose, contribution, and responsibility to others. Are you feeling drawn to share your insights in some way? Sarah asked. Marcus nodded slowly. I've been writing extensively throughout this period. Journals, philosophical reflections, analyses of psychological patterns I've observed in myself. Some of it feels genuinely original and potentially valuable, but I'm not sure how to bridge the gap between my isolated perspective and the social world where such ideas would need to be shared. This dilemma highlighted one of the most complex aspects of voluntary withdrawal. While isolation might facilitate exceptional individual development and insight, the value of those insights was limited if they couldn't be communicated or applied in ways that benefited others. The individuals most capable of achieving profound psychological growth through solitude might also be those least able to translate their discoveries back into conventional social contexts. Sarah had begun to conceptualize this as the integration challenge, the difficulty that individuals faced in finding ways to maintain the authenticity and depth they had developed through isolation while re-engaging sufficiently with the social world to share their insights and contribute to collective human understanding. Some individuals resolved this challenge by becoming writers, artists, or independent researchers who could contribute to society while maintaining relatively minimal direct social contact. Others found ways to engage in carefully chosen teaching or mentoring relationships that honored their need for authenticity while allowing them to share their understanding with others. Still others concluded that complete solitude was more important than contribution and chose to keep their insights private. Marcus seemed to be approaching a decision point about which direction to pursue. His continued engagement in their therapeutic relationship suggested that he was at least open to the possibility of meaningful connection with others. His growing interest in sharing his insights indicated that complete self-focus might not be sustainable indefinitely. But he also remained deeply committed to the authenticity and autonomy he had achieved through isolation. What would meaningful contribution look like for you? Sarah asked. If you could share your insights without compromising the psychological development you've achieved, how would you want to do that? Marcus considered this question for several minutes before responding. I think it would have to be through writing, he said finally. Something that would allow me to communicate my understanding without requiring direct social performance or compromise of my authentic perspective. Maybe a book about the psychology of voluntary withdrawal or a philosophical framework for understanding human potential outside conventional social structures. That sounds like it could honor both your need for autonomy and your desire to contribute, Sarah observed. Yes, but it would also require me to engage with publishers, editors, marketing, and potentially readers in ways that might pull me back into social patterns I've worked to escape, Marcus replied. There's a risk that the process of sharing these insights could contaminate or diminish them. This concern reflected a broader dilemma that Sarah had observed among individuals who had achieved significant psychological development through unconventional means. The very social structures that seemed necessary for sharing their insights were often incompatible with the methods they had used to develop those insights in the first place. It was like trying to describe the experience of silence by making noise, or explaining solitude through social interaction. Some individuals resolved this paradox by accepting that their insights were meant to remain private, serving their own development without broader application. Others found creative ways to minimize social contamination while still enabling some form of contribution. Still others concluded that the value of sharing their understanding outweighed the risks to their personal development and gradually re-engaged with social structures despite the associated costs. Marcus appeared to be moving toward attempting some form of contribution despite the risks involved. During their subsequent sessions, he began sharing more details about his written work and exploring strategies for potential publication that would minimize social engagement while maximizing the authentic communication of his ideas. I've been thinking about our conversations as a prototype, he told Sarah. If I can maintain the depth and authenticity I've developed through isolation while still engaging meaningfully with you, then perhaps I could structure other forms of interaction along similar principles. Sarah realized that their therapeutic relationship had evolved beyond its original purpose. What had begun as a clinical assessment was now serving as Marcus's laboratory for testing whether authentic social connection was possible after profound individual development through isolation. The success or failure of their ongoing dialogue would significantly influence his decisions about future re-engagement with the broader social world. This realization brought both excitement and apprehension. Sarah felt privileged to be part of Marcus's exploration of post-isolation integration, but she also felt the weight of responsibility for modeling the type of authentic interaction that might determine his future willingness to connect with others. As spring approached, marking nearly 2 years since Marcus had begun his voluntary withdrawal, Sarah found herself reflecting on what she had learned from their extended dialogue. His case had challenged many of her assumptions about mental health, human social needs, and the relationship between isolation and psychological development. Marcus had demonstrated that complete social withdrawal could serve as a catalyst for exceptional personal growth and self-understanding, rather than inevitably leading to deterioration or dysfunction. His experience suggested that some individuals might possess psychological characteristics that made conventional social existence more constraining than nurturing, and that extreme autonomy might represent a valid alternative to traditional relationship-based models of human flourishing. At the same time, Marcus's gradual movement toward considering some form of social re-engagement indicated that complete isolation might not be sustainable indefinitely, even for individuals who initially thrived in solitude. The human needs for meaning, purpose, and contribution seemed to eventually require some form of connection with others, even if those connections operated according to different principles than conventional relationships. Sarah had also gained insights into the therapeutic implications of working with individuals who had chosen voluntary withdrawal. Traditional approaches that emphasized the importance of social connection and attempted to encourage re-engagement with family and friends might be counterproductive for these individuals. Instead, therapeutic work might focus on understanding and supporting their unique developmental process while helping them explore options for integration that honored their transformed perspective. Most significantly, Marcus's case had convinced Sarah that the field of psychology needed to expand its understanding of healthy human variation. Just as the profession had eventually recognized that introversion represented a valid personality type rather than a social deficit, it might be time to consider that extreme autonomy and chosen isolation could also represent healthy expressions of human psychological diversity rather than disorders requiring treatment. During one of their final regular sessions, Marcus surprised Sarah by announcing that he had decided to begin writing a book about his experience of voluntary withdrawal and the insights he had developed through prolonged solitude. "I want to create a resource for other people who might be considering similar choices," he explained. "And I want to challenge some of the assumptions that the mental health field makes about isolation and human social needs." "That sounds like a significant step toward re-engagement with the world," Sarah observed. Marcus nodded. "But engagement on my own terms, in a way that honors what I've learned about myself and human potential through this period of withdrawal. I'm not returning to the social world I left. I'm attempting to create a bridge between the insights available through solitude and the collective understanding that could benefit from those insights." Sarah felt a deep sense of satisfaction at this development. Marcus had successfully used their therapeutic relationship as a testing ground for authentic social connection and had concluded that meaningful dialogue was possible without compromising his psychological development. His decision to write about his experience represented a form of integration that honored both his need for autonomy and his desire to contribute to human understanding. Over the following months, Sarah maintained contact with Marcus as he worked on his book and began the gradual process of selective re-engagement with aspects of the social world. He continued to live alone and maintain the autonomous lifestyle he had developed during his period of complete withdrawal. But he also began carefully chosen interactions with editors, researchers, and others who could understand and support his unique perspective. The book he eventually published, titled The Archaeology of Solitude, Discovering Authentic Self Through Voluntary Withdrawal, became an underground classic among individuals who felt constrained by conventional social expectations. It offered both a detailed account of his personal experience and a philosophical framework for understanding human potential outside traditional social structures. Marcus's work sparked ongoing debates within the psychology and philosophy communities about the nature of healthy human variation, the relationship between isolation and creativity, and the possibilities for authentic existence in modern society. Some critics argued that he was promoting dangerous antisocial behavior, while supporters claimed he was illuminating important truths about human potential that had been overlooked by mainstream psychology. For Sarah, Marcus's case became the foundation for her ongoing research into what she termed alternative developmental pathways, ways that individuals might achieve psychological growth and self-actualization through means that differed significantly from conventional therapeutic approaches or social expectations. She continued studying individuals who had chosen various forms of voluntary withdrawal, developing theoretical frameworks and therapeutic approaches that honored their unique developmental processes. Years later, Sarah would look back on her work with Marcus as a turning point in her understanding of human psychology and therapeutic practice. His case had taught her that mental health professionals needed to remain open to the possibility that unconventional choices and behaviors might sometimes represent healthy adaptation rather than pathology. The challenge for the field, as Sarah saw it, was to develop the wisdom to distinguish between withdrawal that served psychological development and withdrawal that represented avoidance or dysfunction. Marcus's case suggested that this distinction couldn't be made based solely on behavior. Someone who completely eliminated social contact might be engaging in profound personal development, while someone who maintains numerous relationships might be avoiding authentic self-confrontation. Instead, the distinction seemed to lie in the individual's relationship to their choice and its consequences. Marcus had approached his withdrawal with intention and awareness, carefully observing its effects on his psychological functioning and remaining open to modifying his approach based on what he learned. He had used his isolation as a tool for growth rather than an escape from growth. Moreover, he had eventually demonstrated the capacity to integrate his insights in ways that benefited others, suggesting that his withdrawal had served a developmental function rather than representing permanent disconnection from human community. His path had been unconventional and extreme, but it had ultimately led to greater rather than diminished capacity for authentic relationship and meaningful contribution. The broader implications of Marcus's case extended beyond individual therapy to questions about social structures and cultural norms. If some individuals required extreme autonomy and solitude to achieve their psychological potential, what did this suggest about the social pressures and expectations that made such dramatic withdrawal necessary? Marcus had described feeling suffocated by the constant pressure for social performance and external validation that characterized modern life. His need for complete isolation might have been as much a response to pathological social conditions as an expression of his individual psychological makeup. From this perspective, the problem wasn't his choice to withdraw, but rather the social environment that made withdrawal feel necessary for authentic development. This raised uncomfortable questions about whether modern society was optimally designed to support human psychological flourishing, or whether it might systematically suppress certain forms of authentic development in favor of social conformity and economic productivity. If individuals like Marcus could only achieve their potential through extreme measures like complete social withdrawal, it suggested that more moderate forms of autonomy and authenticity might be systematically discouraged by mainstream social structures. Sarah's research began exploring these broader social questions while continuing to focus on individual cases of voluntary withdrawal. She found that many of the individuals who chose extreme isolation shared common experiences of feeling pressured to suppress essential aspects of their personality in order to maintain relationships or professional success. They described conventional social life as requiring exhausting levels of performance and compromise that left little energy for authentic self-development. These observations led Sarah to develop what she called the social pressure hypothesis, the idea that extreme withdrawal sometimes represented a healthy response to pathological social expectations rather than a pathological response to healthy social conditions. From this perspective, individuals who chose voluntary isolation weren't fleeing from connection itself, but rather from social structures that punished authenticity and rewarded performance. This hypothesis had significant implications for therapeutic practice and social policy. If the problem lay partly in social conditions rather than individual pathology, then treatment approaches that focus solely on helping individuals adapt to existing social structures might miss important opportunities for supporting healthier forms of human development. The notification chimed softly on Dr. Sarah Chen's laptop as she sat in her cramped office on the 15th floor of the Metropolitan Psychiatric Institute. Another referral. She glanced at the file that had just appeared in her inbox. Marcus Rivera, 34, complete social withdrawal, duration 18 months. The accompanying notes were sparse but telling. Previously successful marketing executive, terminated all relationships, ceased all social contact, lives alone, refuses family intervention. Sarah had seen this pattern countless times throughout her 15 years of clinical practice. Yet each case still fascinated her. The complete severance of human connection wasn't just unusual. It was fundamentally against human nature. Homo sapiens had evolved as social creatures, wired for connection and community. So what drove someone to deliberately cut every tie that bound them to the world? She opened Marcus's file and began reading the preliminary assessment conducted by the intake team. Born in Denver, raised by a single mother, academic achiever, MBA from Northwestern, rapid career advancement, engaged at 29, promotion to senior vice president at 31. Then, according to his sister's account, something shifted. The engagement ended abruptly. Friends reported he became increasingly distant. Colleagues noticed his withdrawal from team meetings and social events. Within 6 months, he had resigned from his position, broken his lease, and moved to a studio apartment across town. His phone went straight to voicemail. His social media accounts vanished. His family received a single text message. "I need space. Please respect that." "I'm fine. That was 18 months ago." Sarah had dedicated her career to understanding what she called voluntary exile, the deliberate choice some individuals made to sever all social connections. Marcus's case had provided a compelling example of what was possible when an individual had the courage and resources to pursue authentic development regardless of social expectations, but it had also highlighted the difficulties and limitations of such extreme approaches. As she prepared to publish her own book about voluntary withdrawal and alternative developmental pathways, Sarah reflected on the broader lessons that Marcus's case offered for understanding human psychology and potential. His experience suggested that human beings possessed far greater capacities for autonomy, self-direction, and individual development than mainstream psychology typically recognized or supported. It also demonstrated that the relationship between isolation and connection was more complex than usually assumed. Rather than representing opposite ends of a spectrum, solitude and relationship might serve different but complementary functions in human development. Some individuals might need extended periods of isolation to develop the self-awareness and authenticity necessary for meaningful connection with others. From this perspective, voluntary withdrawal wasn't necessarily a permanent rejection of human community, but rather a developmental phase that might ultimately enable deeper and more authentic forms of relationship. Marcus's eventual re-engagement with selected aspects of the social world, while maintaining the autonomy he had developed through isolation, provided a model for how such integration might be possible. The challenge for individuals, therapists, and society more broadly was to develop the wisdom and flexibility necessary to support such unconventional developmental paths when they served genuine psychological growth. This required moving beyond rigid assumptions about healthy human functioning toward more nuanced and individualized approaches that honored the full spectrum of human psychological diversity. Marcus's story represented just one example of the alternative pathways to development that might be available to individuals willing to challenge conventional social expectations in service of authentic self-realization. As Sarah continued her research and therapeutic practice, she remained committed to understanding and supporting the full range of human potential, even when it manifested in ways that defied traditional psychological theory and social norms. The man who had chosen to destroy his weak, socially conditioned self in the laboratory of complete isolation had indeed become someone who could not be destroyed by others, not because he had built impenetrable walls around himself, but because he had developed the internal resources and authentic self-knowledge necessary to engage with the world from a position of genuine strength rather than defensive performance. In the end, Marcus's journey through voluntary withdrawal and gradual re-engagement offered a powerful testament to the human capacity for self-directed transformation and the possibility of finding authentic ways of being that honored both individual development and meaningful connection with others. His case challenged the field of psychology to expand its understanding of healthy human variation and to develop more flexible and individualized approaches to supporting human flourishing in all its diverse expressions. Sarah's work with Marcus and others like him continued to evolve as she sought to understand the conditions that enabled such profound self-transformation and the factors that determined whether voluntary withdrawal served development or dysfunction. Each case added new insights to her growing understanding of human psychological potential and the complex relationships between autonomy, authenticity, isolation, and connection. The ultimate lesson of Marcus's case might be that human beings possessed far greater capacities for self-direction and individual development than society typically recognized or encouraged. By creating conditions for authentic self-exploration and refusing to compromise his developing understanding for social approval, he had discovered resources for psychological growth and creative expression that had been invisible within conventional social structures. His story suggested that the choice between isolation and connection might not be permanent or absolute, but rather a dynamic process of finding the optimal balance between individual development and social engagement for each person's unique psychological makeup and life circumstances. The key was developing the self-awareness and courage necessary to make such choices authentically, regardless of social pressures or expectations. Therapists and others who worked with individuals considering or experiencing voluntary withdrawal, Marcus's case provided important insights into how such experiences might be understood and supported. Rather than automatically pathologizing the choice to withdraw, practitioners might need to assess whether isolation was serving developmental functions and help individuals navigate the complex process of eventual integration in ways that honored their transformed perspective. The broader implications of this work extended to questions about social structures and cultural norms that might need to evolve to better support the full range of human psychological diversity. As society continued to change and individuals sought new forms of authentic expression and development, the field of psychology would need to remain open to unconventional pathways and alternative definitions of mental health and human flourishing. Marcus's journey from successful social performance to chosen isolation to selective re-engagement represented one example of how such evolution might unfold. His willingness to question fundamental assumptions about human social needs and to experiment with radical alternatives had yielded insights that enriched not only his own development, but also the broader understanding of human psychological potential. The story of his transformation continued to inspire Sarah's work and challenge her thinking about the nature of therapeutic intervention and the goals of mental health practice. Rather than simply helping people adapt to existing social structures, therapy might need to support individuals in discovering and creating ways of being that were genuinely aligned with their authentic selves, even when those ways differed significantly from conventional expectations. In this sense, Marcus's case represented not just an individual success story, but a contribution to the ongoing evolution of human consciousness and social possibility. By demonstrating that profound self-development was possible through unconventional means, he had expanded the range of options available to others who felt constrained by traditional social patterns and relationship structures. His eventual integration of solitude-derived insights with meaningful contribution to others provided a model for how individual development and social responsibility might be balanced in ways that honored both personal authenticity and collective growth. The book he wrote and the conversations he engaged in represented forms of connection that emerged from strength rather than neediness, offering rather than demanding, creating rather than consuming. Instead, therapy might need to help individuals find ways to create social connections that honored their authentic selves, even if those connections differed significantly from conventional relationship patterns. It might also need to validate the choice of temporary or permanent withdrawal when social conditions were genuinely incompatible with an individual's psychological needs. Marcus's case had convinced Sarah that the field of psychology needed to develop more nuanced and flexible approaches to understanding human social needs. Rather than assuming that all individuals required the same types and levels of social connection, practitioners might need to assess each person's unique psychological makeup and help them find relationship patterns that supported rather than constrained their development. This individualized approach to social needs aligned with broader trends in psychology toward recognizing human diversity and avoiding one-size-fits-all models of mental health. Just as the field had learned to appreciate differences in learning styles, emotional expression, and cognitive processing, it might need to develop similar appreciation for differences in social needs and optimal relationship patterns. The question remained whether society more broadly could develop the flexibility to accommodate such diversity in social preferences and needs. The pressure for social conformity served important functions in maintaining community cohesion and shared values, but it might also systematically exclude or marginalize individuals whose authentic development required alternatives to conventional social patterns. Sarah's ongoing research continued to explore these tensions between individual authenticity and social cohesion, seeking to understand how both could be honored without sacrificing either. Unlike depression-induced isolation, which typically involved a gradual withdrawal accompanied by sadness and loss of interest, voluntary exile seemed purposeful, almost strategic. These individuals didn't appear to be running from something, they seemed to be running towards something else entirely. The phenomenon wasn't new. Throughout history, hermits, monks, and mystics had chosen solitude as a path to enlightenment or spiritual growth, But the modern iteration Sarah encountered in her practice was different. These weren't individuals seeking God or transcendence in the wilderness. They were urban dwellers, often highly educated and previously successful, who made calculated decisions to eliminate human contact from their lives entirely. Marcus's case represented a particularly intriguing subset of this behavior. According to his employment records, he had been extraordinarily successful in his career, precisely the kind of person society would expect to be deeply integrated into social networks. His sudden withdrawal suggested that his isolation wasn't a response to failure or inadequacy, but rather to something more complex. Sarah's research had led her to develop what she termed the fortress theory of total withdrawal. Like medieval fortifications, these individuals seemed to be creating impenetrable barriers around themselves, not necessarily to keep the world out, but to create a space where they could exist without interference or judgment. The question that drove her work was whether this fortress served as protection or prison, and whether the individuals inside were prisoners or architects of their own liberation. The theoretical framework she had developed drew heavily from the work of psychologist Carl Jung, who had written extensively about the process of individuation, the psychological integration of conscious and unconscious elements of the psyche to achieve self-realization. Jung himself had experienced what he called his confrontation with the unconscious, a period of intense isolation and introspection that lasted several years. During this time, he largely withdrew from professional and social obligations to focus on understanding his inner psychological landscape. But Jung's withdrawal had been temporary and purposeful, leading to profound insights that would later influence the entire field of psychology. The individuals Sarah studied seemed to be engaged in a similar process, but without the clear intention or philosophical framework that had guided Jung's journey. They were pioneers in uncharted psychological territory, navigating by instinct rather than map. The morning sun streamed through Sarah's office windows as she prepared for her first session with Marcus. After months of family pressure and ultimately a court-ordered evaluation following concerns about his mental health, he had finally agreed to meet with her. The conditions he had set were strict: no family involvement, no group therapy, no medication unless absolutely necessary, and complete confidentiality regarding the content of their sessions. When Marcus entered her office, Sarah was struck by his presence. Despite 18 months of isolation, he didn't appear disheveled or malnourished as she might have expected. Instead, he seemed remarkably composed, almost serene. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that had grown longer than conventional business standards but was well maintained. His clothes were simple but clean: dark jeans, a grey sweater, and worn leather boots. Most notably, he maintained direct eye contact, something many isolated individuals struggled with after extended periods without social interaction. "Dr. Chen," he said, settling into the chair across from her desk, "I want to be clear from the beginning that I'm here under duress. I don't consider myself ill, and I don't believe I need treatment. I'm participating in this process because it's apparently the only way to satisfy the legal requirements and get everyone to leave me alone." Sarah nodded, appreciating his directness. "I understand your position, Marcus. I'm not here to force you back into a life you've chosen to leave behind. I'm genuinely curious about your experience and what led you to make such a dramatic change." For the first time since entering the office, Marcus's expression shifted slightly. Where there had been polite wariness, she detected a flicker of genuine interest. "You're not going to spend an hour explaining why isolation is unhealthy and humans need social connection. I think you already know what the textbooks say about human social needs," Sarah replied. "What interests me is what you've discovered that the textbooks don't address." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, studying her face as if trying to determine whether her interest was genuine or merely a therapeutic technique. Finally, he spoke. "Most people assume that someone who cuts off all social contact must be running away from something traumatic or devastating: a death, a betrayal, a public humiliation. They can't conceive that someone might choose isolation not as an escape, but as a destination. And for you, isolation was a destination?" "More than that," Marcus said, his voice gaining intensity. "It was a laboratory. For 32 years, I lived my life according to other people's expectations, definitions, and measurements of success. I climbed every ladder they pointed to, achieved every milestone they valued, played every role they assigned me. And I was good at it. Exceptional, even. But I was disappearing. This concept of disappearing within one's own successful life had emerged repeatedly in Sarah's research. It wasn't failure that drove these individuals to isolation. It was the suffocating weight of external validation and social performance. They described feeling like actors who had become so skilled at playing various roles that they had lost touch with their authentic selves. Marcus continued, "The breaking point came during what should have been one of the happiest moments of my life. I was at my engagement party, surrounded by friends and family, receiving congratulations on my promotion and upcoming wedding. Everyone was celebrating this perfect life I had constructed. And I realized I felt absolutely nothing. Not happiness, not satisfaction, not connection to any of these people I supposedly cared about. I was a ghost haunting my own existence." The engagement party story resonated with something Sarah had been exploring in her theoretical work. She had begun to conceptualize total withdrawal as potentially representing what she called ontological rebellion, a revolt not against specific people or circumstances, but against the fundamental structures of social existence itself. These individuals weren't rejecting bad relationships or toxic environments. They were rejecting the entire framework of relational existence. "The period immediately after that realization was the most terrifying of my life," Marcus continued, "because once you see the performance clearly, you can't unsee it. Every conversation became theatrical. Every emotion felt manufactured. Every relationship seemed transactional. I started questioning whether anything I had ever felt or wanted was genuinely mine, or whether it had all been programmed into me by family, society, media, and peer pressure." This transformation from a man who felt he was disappearing within his successful social life to someone who had discovered profound resources for authentic development and creative contribution illustrated the remarkable capacity for human renewal and growth that existed when individuals had the courage to challenge conventional definitions of success and healthy functioning. As Sarah continued her research and practice, she carried forward the lessons learned from Marcus's case while remaining open to the new insights and challenges that each individual brought to the ongoing exploration of human psychological potential and the diverse pathways through which it might be realized. The field of psychology, and perhaps society more broadly, was slowly expanding to accommodate and support this greater recognition of human diversity and the multiple forms that authentic development and meaningful existence might take. The man who had chosen to destroy his weak self through voluntary withdrawal had indeed become indestructible, not through building walls, but through discovering the inexhaustible resources for growth, creativity, and authentic connection that existed within him when freed from the constraints of social performance and external validation. His story continued to serve as both inspiration and challenge for others seeking their own paths to authentic development and meaningful existence in an increasingly complex and demanding world.